What happens when you follow an old service road to find 3 rotting trailers arranged in a perfect circle with skull strings teaching lessons in carved bone? When you discover what your grandfather kept in his Blue Ridge cellar and why it had no face and moved with sounds like suction? When you hear breathing behind a boulder all night that continues with mechanical patience until dawn? Or when you inherit a cabin surrounded by wires strung with tiny bones and find tall figures standing at the tree line watching with whatever senses they possess? Tonight we bring you the final 4 account from the Appalachian backcountry where Rhett McKee met a canvas-hatted man who told him to run, where Elaine Hart discovered her grandfather's preservation jars held things that defied anatomy, where Murrin Vale learned that true isolation doesn't exist because something is always breathing in the darkness, and where Theo Garner violated a bone line and found that leaving doesn't mean forgetting when the mountains decide you belong to them. These stories complete the testimony of 8 people who enter the deep places of the oldest mountains and return changed, carrying tokens that pulse with a breath of territory that remembers and chooses and never truly releases those who've seen what lives in the folds where sunlight doesn't reach in patience is measured in centuries rather than moments. My name is Rhett McKay, and I was 31 when I inherited my grandfather Ellis's property deep in the Kudzu Choke backcountry where Tennessee and North Carolina blur together into hill country that refuses to acknowledge which state it belongs to. The house itself was nearly swallowed by kudzu vines that had been growing unchecked for the 5 years since Ellis had died, and the property had sat in legal limbo during estate disputes among relatives who didn't want the land but couldn't agree on what to do with it. I'd been volunteered to clean the place up enough to sell, armed with a pole Aries side-by-side and a chainsaw, and the naive assumption that clearing kudzu was the hardest part of the job I'd face. The first week I focused on the main house, cutting back vines and discovering the structure underneath was in worse shape than expected. Rut in the support beams, roof caving on one side, walls literally held together by the kudzu that had grown through gaps in the siding. On the 8th day I decided to explore the property more thoroughly, following an old service road I'd noticed on the survey map that led into the denser part of the woods away from the house. The pole areas handled the rough terrain easily, and I followed the overgrown track for maybe 20 minutes before emerging into a small clearing in a natural depression surrounded by black locust trees. That's where I found the 3 trailers arranged in a perfect triangle, each one rotted and collapsing but positioned with mathematical precision around a central fire pit that looked like it had been used recently based on the ash and charred wood. Strung between the trailers on lengths of wire were small skulls, birds, maybe some small mammals, dozens of them threaded like beads on a necklace with strips of leather or cloth tied between them. The skulls had symbols carved into their foreheads or markings made with what might have been ash or paint, and they swayed slightly in the breeze, creating a soft clicking sound like wind chimes made from bone. I knew immediately I should leave, should start the pole areas and drive away and forget I'd ever found this clearing. But the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at car accidents kept me there examining the trailers and the skull strings and trying to understand what purpose this arrangement served. The symbols carved into the skulls repeated in patterns, spirals and hash marks and geometric shapes that looked almost like attempts at writing or recording information. Behind the largest trailer, I found a stone foundation that looked far older than the trailers themselves, stairs descending into the ground toward what might have been a cellar or root cellar from some structure that had stood here long before the trailers arrived. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved from stone or maybe just naturally formed from bedrock, and it descended into darkness that my phone flashlight barely penetrated. I made it down maybe 8 steps before I saw them, burlap sacks hanging from hooks in the stone walls, dozens of them, and some of them were moving, not dramatically, not thrashing, just small movements like something inside was breathing or shifting position. I heard that breathing then, wet and labored, coming from deeper in the underground space, and I started backing up the stairs, slowly trying not to make sound that would alert whatever was down there to my presence. I almost made it back to the surface when a hand gripped my shoulder, solid, real, human warmth through my shirt. I spun around expecting to see something horrible from the underground space, but instead saw an old man in canvas work clothes and a hat made from the same material, his face deeply lined and weathered, his eyes carrying the kind of knowledge that comes from living in the mountain for generations. "You need to run, son," he said quietly, his voice like gravel. "Run now and don't come back to this property. Some things are better left to rot with the kudzu." He released my shoulder and gestured toward my pole Aries, and I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to the pole Aries and started it with hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys, glancing back once to see the old man in canvas standing at the top of the stone stairs watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not threatening, but not friendly either. More like a teacher watching a student who just learned a necessary but painful lesson. I drove the pole areas back toward my grandfather's house as fast as the rough terrain allowed. Branches whipping past and the skull strings clicking fading behind me until all I could hear was the engine and my own gasping breaths and the voice in my head repeating the canvas man's words. Run now and don't come back. When I reached the main house, I didn't even go inside to gather the few personal items I brought with me. I got straight into my truck and drove toward the main highway, my mind racing with questions about what the trailers were for, what was in those moving burlap sacks, what the symbols on the skulls meant, and who the canvas man was, and how he'd appeared exactly when I needed a warning to override my dangerous curiosity. None of those questions had good answers, and I was starting to understand that some mysteries in the Appalachian backcountry existed specifically to remain unsolved. 2 days later, I called the estate lawyer from a hotel room 2 states away and told her to sell the property as is without any cleanup or improvements, price it low enough that someone would buy it quickly, and send me whatever money remained after she took her fees. She tried to argue that clearing the kudzu and making basic repairs would increase the value substantially, but I cut her off and told her I was never going back to that property and she could sell it to whoever wanted land with trailers and skull strings and stone foundations hiding things in burlap sacks that breathed in the darkness. The property sold within a month to a development company that planned to clear the land for suburban development, and I hope whoever bought it had the sense to burn those trailers and fill in that stone foundation with concrete before building houses where families with children would live. I left the key to my grandfather's house under a loose brick near the front steps as instructed by the lawyer, and I never asked what happened to the property after that, or whether the development actually went through, or if the company discovered what I'd found and decided some land wasn't worth the price no matter how cheap. The canvas man's face stayed with me for months afterward, appearing in dreams where he'd stand at the edge of clearings or the bottom of stone stays, always watching, always silent except for that one warning he'd given me. I researched my grandfather's property records and old county maps trying to find some mention of who owned the trailers or what the stone foundation had been part of originally, but the records were incomplete or deliberately vague, references to old homesteads and previous structures without any details about who'd lived there or when they'd left or why. What haunted me most wasn't what I'd seen, but what I'd almost seen. The fact that I'd been seconds away from descending those stairs fully, from investigating those moving burlap sacks, from discovering what was breathing in the darkness below. The canvas man had saved me from knowledge I shouldn't have, and I wondered how many other people had come to that clearing over the years, how many had ignored warnings or hadn't received warnings at all, and what had happened to them in that underground space where symbols carved in bone taught lessons no human should learn. My name is Elaine Hart, and I was 29 when my cousin Paige Lowell invited me to help clean out her grandfather Walter's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a weekend project that seemed straightforward until we discovered what Walter had been keeping in the cellar and why certain parts of the cabin smelled like preservation chemicals and rotting meat despite appearing clean on the surface. Paige was 31, recently unemployed, and saw the cabin as potential rental income if we could clean it up enough to list some vacation rental sites. Her grandfather had died 6 months earlier, and the property had sat empty since then, mail piling up in the box and raccoons apparently using the porch as a latrine based on the droppings we found everywhere. We arrived on a Saturday morning in October, armed with cleaning supplies and garbage bags, and the optimistic assumption that 2 women with determination could handle anything an old cabin might contain. The interior wasn't as bad as the exterior suggested, dusty and stale but structurally sound. Furniture that needed cleaning but wasn't damaged beyond repair, normal old person accumulation of newspapers and canned goods, and the kind of clutter that builds up when someone lives alone for decades. But there were details that bothered me even during that first walkthrough. Mason jars filled with yellowish liquid and what looked like organic matter suspended in the fluid, labels written in handwriting I couldn't read, stored on shelves in the kitchen like this was normal food preservation rather than something deeply wrong. Paige found the cellar door behind a stack of boxes in what had been Walter's bedroom, a heavy wooden door with a padlock that looked new despite the cabin's general age and neglect. "I didn't even know this place had a cellar," she said, examining the lock. "Grandpa never mentioned it. I wonder what he was storing down there that needed locking." We spent 20 minutes searching for a key before Paige decided to just cut the lock with bolt cutters from her truck. And the moment the door swung open, we were hit with a smell that made both of us gag and step back. Formaldehyde and decay and something chemical and organic combined into an odor that spoke of preservation and rot happening simultaneously. The stairs descended steeply into darkness that my phone flashlight barely penetrated. Stone steps that looked hand-carved and much older than the cabin above. I went down first with Paige following close behind, both of us breathing through our mouths to avoid the smell as much as possible. The cellar was larger than expected, extending beyond the footprint of the cabin above, with a dirt floor and stone walls and a workbench along one side that held tools I recognized from biology classes, scalpels and clamps and instruments designed for dissection or maybe surgery. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams, some empty but some holding what looked like burlap sacks tied at the top, bulky shapes inside that I didn't want to examine too closely. But what made me stop backing toward the stairs was the jars. Dozens of mason jars on shelves lining the far wall, each one filled with that same yellowish fluid I'd seen upstairs, and each one containing something that looked organic and complex. Not simple tissue samples, but structures that might have been organs or body parts or things I couldn't identify because they didn't match any anatomy I was familiar with. Some jars had labels with dates going back decades. Some had what might have been names or codes. And on the workbench, partially covered by a stained cloth, was something large and pale that I only glimpsed before Paige grabbed my arm. "Elaine, the door," she whispered, her voice high with panic. I turned and saw that the cellar door at the top of the stairs had swung closed, and we definitely hadn't closed it. We'd left it propped open with a box to prevent exactly the scenario. Paige ran up the stairs and tried the door, pushing and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. It stuck or locked or something. I can't get it open. Above us, from inside the cabin, we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor directly over our heads. And then Paige's voice, Paige's exact voice, calling from a bedroom. "Elaine, are you down there? I need help with something. Can you come up here?" Paige was standing right beside me at the top of the cellar stairs, trying desperately to open the locked door. So the voice calling from the bedroom using her exact tone and inflection couldn't be her. We both froze listening to the footsteps move from bedroom to what sounded like the kitchen, accompanied by that voice, Paige's voice, continuing to call for me with increasing urgency. "Elaine, seriously, I need your help right now. Something's wrong. Please come here." The mimicry was perfect, capturing even the slight rasp Paige got when she was stressed or scared, and if I hadn't been standing next to the real Paige, I would have believed it was her and gone to help without question. "What the fuck?" Paige whispered, her face gone pale in the dim light from our phone flashlights. "What the actual fuck is happening?" I didn't have an answer because nothing about this situation made sense. Doors locking themselves, voices being stolen and replayed, the preserved specimens in jars suggesting her grandfather had been doing something down here that went far beyond normal rural eccentricity. The footsteps above stopped directly over our position at the top of the cellar stairs, and we heard new sounds. Dragging. Something heavy being pulled across the floor, and then a voice that wasn't Paige's voice but wasn't quite anything else either, speaking in words I couldn't understand, but that sounded like they might have been an actual language from somewhere or sometime I'd never encountered. From the back of the cellar, near those shelves of jars, came a new sound that made both of us turn our flashlights toward the source. One of the burlap sacks had fallen from its hook and landed on the dirt floor with a wet thud, and the fabric was moving. Not dramatically, not thrashing, but shifting and bulging like something inside was trying to free itself from confining material. The sack split along old seams, and something emerged that I can still see clearly in night maze 5 years later. A creature roughly human-sized, but with proportions that were completely wrong. Skin that looked waxy and pale like it had never seen sunlight, and most horrifying of all, a face that had no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth skin where those should have been. But somehow I knew it was looking at us, could sense us despite having no visible organ for sensing anything. The thing moved toward us with a motion that involved joints bending in directions human joints don't bend, making a sound like suction cups pulling from smooth surface with each movement. Paige began kicking the cellar door with both feet, screaming now despite the risk that whatever was upstairs might hear and respond, just desperate to get out of this underground space before the faceless thing reached the stairs. The door finally gave way, Paige's boot breaking through rotten wood near the handle, and she reached through to unlock it from the other side while I kept my flashlight trained on the approaching creature, trying to judge how much time we had before it reached us. We burst through the door into the bedroom, and Paige slammed it shut behind us, but there was nothing to lock it with since we'd cut off the padlock. We ran through the cabin toward the front door, not bothering to look for whatever had been making footsteps and using Paige's voice. Just focus on getting outside into sunlight and open space where we could see threats coming. The front door was standing open. We'd definitely closed and locked it when we arrived, and we ran through it into the yard where Paige's truck was parked. We were halfway to the truck when Paige stopped abruptly and grabbed my arm, pointing toward the tree line about 30 yards from the cabin. A shadow stood there, and I use the word shadow deliberately because it didn't look solid or fully three-dimensional, more like a dark cutout against the trees, impossibly tall, maybe 9 or 10 feet, with vaguely humanoid shape but wrong proportions similar to what we'd seen in the cellar. It didn't move toward us or make any threatening gesture. It just stood at the border between Walter's property and the wild forest beyond, and I had the distinct impression it was waiting to see what we would do. "Get in the truck," I said quietly. We backed toward the vehicle, keeping our eyes on the shadow figure. Got in, and Paige started the engine with hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. As we drove down the rough road away from the cabin, I looked back and saw the tall shadow following us, moving between trees with a gliding motion that suggested it wasn't walking so much as flowing through the space. It followed us all the way to the main highway where pavement replaced dirt, and at that exact boundary it stopped, standing motionless as we accelerated away. And I realized with cold certainty that it hadn't been chasing us. It had been escorting us out, making sure we left its territory and didn't come back. My name is Morin Vale, and I was 34 when I planned a week of solo camping in the Blue Valley Range, calculated isolation, designed to reset my mental health after a brutal year of work stress and relationship failure, and the general accumulation of urban existence wearing down my resilience. I'm not reckless about backcountry camping. I'd researched the area thoroughly, carried proper gear including a hand-crank emergency radio and multiple knives and fire-starting equipment, left my itinerary with 3 different people, and chosen a route that was remote but not suicidally dangerous. What I didn't account for was that some places in the mountains don't care how prepared you are because preparation assumes normal threats like weather and animals and injury, not what I encountered on my second night camp beside a large boulder outcropping in a narrow valley where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest human was at least 15 miles away. The first night passed uneventfully. I set up my tent, built a fire, ate freeze-dried food, and fell asleep to the normal sounds of a mountain forest at night. I woke on the second day feeling refreshed and optimistic about my decision to escape civilization for a week. I spent the day hiking a loop trail, filtering water from a creek, and generally appreciating the silence and solitude I'd been craving. As the evening approached, I noticed something odd near my campsite, a mound of freshly disturbed earth about 10 feet from my tent, maybe 3 feet in diameter. Dirt piled up like something had been digging or burrowing from below. I examined it carefully, but couldn't determine what animal might have made it. The soil was loose and still slightly damp, suggesting the disturbance was recent, possibly while I'd been away on my day hike. That night as I sat by my fire cooking dinner, I heard my name. Not shouted, not loud, but whispered from somewhere just beyond the firelight, spoken clearly enough that there was no mistaking it for wind or animal sounds. Morin Vale. I stood up and called out, "Who's there?" but received no response. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the area around my camp, seeing nothing but trees and rocks and the darkness between them. I told myself it was my imagination, that isolation was already affecting me more than I'd expected, that my brain was creating sounds from white noise because I was alone and alert for threats. The whispering of my name continued intermittently throughout the evening, always from just outside my visual range, never close enough that I could identify a source, but always distinct enough that I couldn't dismiss it as imagination. By 11 p.m., I was exhausted from adrenaline and hypervigilance, and despite my fear, I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep inside my tent with my knife in my hand, and my phone recording audio in case I caught evidence of whatever was out there. I woke around 3 a.m. to silence, not the normal forest silence with insects and small animals making background noise, but absolute silence like all life had evacuated the area except me and whatever had been whispering my name. That's when I heard the breathing. It came from behind a large boulder outcropping maybe 8 feet from my tent, slow and deep and rhythmic, the sound of something large inhaling and exhaling with mechanical regularity. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag listening to that breathing continue without variation or pause, each breath lasting about 10 seconds in and 10 seconds out. For over an hour, the sound never moved or changed, just constant breathing from behind that rock, And the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that whatever was breathing was doing it deliberately, was letting me know it was demonstrating patience and endurance far beyond anything human or even animal in its ability to just breathe steadily without moving or making any other sound for hours. Dawn came with agonizing slowness, gray light gradually filtering into my tent, and the breathing behind the boulder continuing until the sky was fully light and birds finally started making tentative morning calls. Only then did the breathing stop, cut off abruptly mid-exhale like someone had pressed a pause button, replaced by the normal sound of a mountain forest waking up. I packed my gear in record time, not bothering with breakfast organization, just throwing everything into my pack and starting to hike out toward the trailhead where I'd left my car 4 days earlier. I hiked out at near running pace, my pack poorly organized and digging into my shoulders, but my fear overriding discomfort and a desire to do anything except put distance between myself and that boulder where something had breathed all night, demonstrating patience no living thing should possess. The trail was clear in daylight, well marked and easy to follow, and I made it maybe 3 miles before I had to stop to catch my breath and adjust my pack strap that were cutting off circulation to my arms. That's when I saw it, the footprint in the center of the trail, pressed into a patch of soft earth left muddy by yesterday's brief rain shower. The footprint was huge, maybe 3 feet long and proportionally wide, with clear impressions suggesting toes or claws at one end, but no heel mark at the other end, like whatever made it had been standing on its toes or the front half of its foot with no weight on the back. But what made the print impossible to rationalize as any known animal was that it appeared completely isolated, no trail of prints leading to it or away from it, no mark suggesting something had jumped and landed there, just this single enormous footprint in the middle of the trail like something had materialized there long enough to press one foot into the mud and then vanish without moving in any direction. I backed away from the print without touching it or examining it more closely, some instinct telling me that studying it too carefully might draw attention I absolutely did not want, and resumed my hike out at an even faster pace. The remaining 12 miles of the trailhead passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear and the constant feeling of being watched by something that could move through the forest without leaving consecutive tracks, something that breathed behind boulders all night without any visible purpose except to let you know it was there, something that knew my name and had whispered it from the darkness like an invitation or warning. I reached my car in late afternoon, threw my pack in the trunk without unpacking it, and drove straight home without stopping except for gas and bathroom breaks, a 9-hour drive that I completed in something like 7 hours because I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped moving for too long, whatever had been in those mountains might catch up somehow. Back in my apartment, surrounded by city noise and concrete and the anonymous presence of thousands of other humans, I finally felt safe enough to break down, sitting on my bathroom floor crying with relief and residual terror for nearly an hour. The recording from my phone had captured the breathing, 5 hours of slow, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations, so consistent it sounded almost mechanical except for occasional wet quality that suggested organic lungs rather than equipment. I deleted the file after listening to it once because hearing that sound outside the context of terror made it somehow worse, made it clear that whatever had been breathing wasn't confused or curious or even aggressive. It was just there, breathing, existing with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world, and I was briefly interesting but ultimately irrelevant to whatever purpose drove its existence. I made a resolution that night sitting in my bathroom surrounded by familiar walls and normal sounds. I would never camp alone again, would never seek isolation in places where help was hours or days away, would never again trust my preparation and research to protect me from things that didn't follow rules about tracks or breathing or staying in the darkness where they belonged. The mountains had taught me that true isolation doesn't exist because something is always there, always watching, always breathing behind boulders waiting for dawn. And the price of that lesson was a permanent loss of the solitude I'd been seeking. My name is Theo Garner, and I was 42 when I inherited a cabin on the Tennessee-North Carolina border from a great uncle I'd met exactly twice in my life, a property that came with warnings from relatives who suggested selling it immediately without ever visiting, advice I ignored because I wanted to see what I'd inherited before making decisions about keeping or selling. The cabin sat at the end of a Forest Service road that hadn't been maintained in years, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicle, surrounded by dense woods and complete isolation from any neighbors or services. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late November, planning to spend the weekend assessing the property and making an inventory of anything valuable that might be inside. The cabin itself was small but solidly built, one room with a loft and a stone fireplace, furniture that looked handmade and weathered by decades of use. But what caught my attention immediately was a wire strung between trees around the entire perimeter of the property, about chest height, with small bones tied at regular intervals along its length. The bones were bird-sized mostly, some small mammals, each one secured with thin strips of what looked like leather or dried plant fiber, and each strip had symbols carved or burned into it. Marks that repeated in patterns suggesting meaning rather than random decoration. I should have left immediately. Every rational part of my brain recognized this as a warning system or boundary marker or some kind of deliberate message that property was claimed or protected or forbidden. But curiosity and my own assumption that I had legal right to be there overrode the visceral unease the bone line created. I documented it with photos on my phone, thinking it might be interesting folk art or cultural artifact, and then I went inside the cabin to explore what my great-uncle had left behind. The interior was cluttered but not dirty. Shelves full of books about Appalachian folklore and local history, journals written in handwriting I couldn't read, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams in bundles tied with the same leather strips I'd seen on the bone line outside. I found a Coleman lantern with fuel still in it and got it lit as darkness fell earlier than expected in the narrow hollow where the cabin Saturday. By 7 p.m. full night had settled, and I was starting to think about making dinner when I heard the first sounds. Something heavy moving around the cabin, circling the building with footsteps that were perfectly regular and rhythmic like a metronome measuring out exact intervals between each step. The circling continued for maybe 20 minutes, footsteps maintaining that exact rhythm, and then came the whisper through the walls. Not muffled or distant, but clear like someone was standing right inside the cabin speaking directly into my ear despite the impossibility of that, given I could see the entire single-room interior, and I was alone. The voice was low and genderless and spoke English with perfect clarity. You don't belong here. This land remembers. This land chooses. You are not chosen. Leave. The whisper repeated the same message 3 times, with those perfectly spaced footsteps continuing their circuit around the outside of the cabin, and then both sounds stopped simultaneously, leaving silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat and nothing else. I sat in that silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, trying to decide if I should leave immediately in the dark or wait until morning when I could see to navigate the rough road back to civilization. The decision was made for me when the footsteps started again, but this time they weren't circling. They were on the roof directly above my head, walking back and forth across the shingles with that same measured rhythm. And the whisper came again, but now from above. Leave. While you can leave. While leaving is permitted. I didn't pack carefully or check to make sure I had everything. I grabbed my keys and my phone and opened the cabin door, intending to run to my truck and drive away immediately. But I stopped in the doorway because something had changed while I'd been inside. The bone line, the wire strung with dozens of small bones that had surrounded the property when I'd arrived, was completely bare, clean. Every single bone had been removed, leaving just the wire and the leather strips, but no bones, no evidence they'd ever been there except the photos on my phone showing them clearly. Someone or something had removed dozens of bones from around the property while I'd been inside the cabin, and they'd done it silently and completely within the span of maybe 2 hours. I ran to my truck and got the door open, my hand shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. I turned on the headlights to illuminate the narrow road leading away from the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Figures standing at the tree line, maybe 30 or 40 of them arranged in a rough semicircle around the cabin property. Tall, 7 or 8 feet at minimum, with shoulders and heads visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, but no faces or features I could make out at this distance. They stood completely motionless, not advancing but not retreating, just watching me with whatever senses they possessed, and I had the overwhelming impression they'd been there all along, watching through the windows while I'd explored the cabin, watching while something circled the building and walked on the roof, waiting to see what I would do. I put the truck in reverse and backed away slowly, not wanting to turn around and show them my back, keeping them visible in my headlights until I reached the point where the road curved and I could no longer see the cabin or the tree line. Only then did I turn around properly and accelerate away, driving too far for the rough road but not caring about damage to my vehicle or the danger of losing control, just focused on putting distance between myself and those watchers who'd stood silent and patient at the border between the cabin property and the wild forest beyond. I drove without stopping until I reached the main highway where streetlights and passing traffic represented human civilization, and the normal world where property lines were legal constructs and warnings were written in English on signs rather than in symbols on bones. In a gas station parking lot at 2 a.m., I finally stopped shaking enough to call my relatives and tell them I was never going back to that property, that they could handle the estate sale or abandonment or whatever legal process was required to divest ownership. But I would never return to that cabin or that hollow or that border between Tennessee and North Carolina where things stood at tree lines counting how many humans violated boundaries marked in bone. The next day I started finding them, the bone fragments. Small pieces in my truck's door pocket where I hadn't put anything. A tiny vertebra in my jacket pocket I was certain hadn't been there when I'd left the cabin. Fragments too small to notice immediately but clearly placed deliberately in my belongings by whatever had removed the bones from the wire. They kept appearing for weeks in places I'd already searched. My apartment filling with these small reminders that I'd brought something back with me from those mountains, that whatever had marked that cabin property had decided to mark me as well. And no amount of cleaning or disposing of the bones made them stop appearing because they weren't coming from anywhere logical. They were just manifesting in my pockets and bags and corners of my apartment like the mountains themselves were breathing. These tokens into my life through some channel I couldn't identify or block. 5 years later I still find them occasionally. A bird skull on my car dashboard, a strip of leather with carved symbols in my work briefcase, tiny bones arranged in patterns on my windowsill that I absolutely did not place there. And sometimes late at night I hear, faint but unmistakable, that rhythmic whisper from the cabin. Those words that told me to leave, except now they say you left. But you took something, and something took from you. The mountains remember. The mountains breathe through what you carry. And in those moments I understand that my great uncle's warnings through relatives I barely knew weren't about the cabin itself, but about what happens when you ignore bone lines and enter spaces that were marked forbidden, and how some violations of territory can't be undone by simply leaving because you can never fully leave if the place decides you belong to it instead of it belonging to you. These 8 accounts from the Appalachian backcountry share a common thread that impossible to ignore once you've heard them all. Places that remember, trails that swallow, voices that mimic perfectly, men in canvas hats who appear to warn rather than threaten, things that prefer underground spaces and darkness and the patient watching that comes from existing far longer than human lifespans or human understanding. Noah Eloise cruel space creature that called his name in a voice like mud. Cohen Reese's fox hollow that stole his cousin and used their voices to lure others into mimicry and darkness. Avery Cole's exploring finger pressing through tent fabric with horrible curiosity. Jonah Merritt's dirt-wrapped figure that chanted in unknown languages. Rhett McKay's trailer circle with bone charms teaching symbols. Elaine Hart's faceless thing in her grandfather's cellar. Maureen Vale's breathing behind the boulder that continued all night with mechanical patience. And Theo Garner's bone line that marked boundaries enforced by tall watchers who stood at tree lines counting violations. Each story stands alone as an account of individuals encountering something in the mountains that shouldn't exist, but taken together they suggest something larger, that these aren't isolated incidents, but glimpses of the same underlying reality, different facets of whatever lives in the folds and hollows and deep places of the oldest mountains in North America. The Appalachians have been here for hundreds of millions of years, worn down from heights that rival the Himalayas to the gentle curves we see today, and in all that time something has made the deep places home. Something that predates human habitation and will outlast human departure. Something that marks territory with bones and symbols and the patient watching that comes from existing outside normal time. The warnings are consistent across accounts. Leave, don't return. You don't belong here. This land chooses. The watchers appear in different forms, but always with that same quality of ancient patience and the impression that humans are briefly interesting but ultimately irrelevant except when we violate marked boundaries or enter spaces that were deliberately sealed or approach too close to whatever breathes underground. The mimicry suggests intelligence that studied us long enough to understand how to use our own voices and relationships against us. The preservation in jars and the things in burlap sacks suggest curiosity about human anatomy that's clinical rather than aggressive. The curiosity of something that's been watching us for generations and occasionally takes samples for reasons we can't comprehend. And then there are the objects that follow people home. Avery's carved bark that appeared in his pack. Theo's bone fragments that keep manifesting in his apartment. The sense that once you've been marked by the mountains, they maintain some connection to you regardless of how far you physically distance yourself from the territory where the encounter occurred. Like the mountains breathe through these tokens, maintaining awareness of those who entered their deep places and took notice, reminding them that leaving doesn't mean forgetting and geographical distance doesn't mean true separation. I sit in my city apartment now, 20 stories above street level, surrounded by concrete and steel and the anonymous density of urban existence. But on my windowsill is an object I did not place there, a piece of bark with a spiral carved into it, the carving fresh enough that wood shavings still cling to the grooves. I've never been to the Appalachians. I've never camped in the backcountry or explored hollows or investigated inherited cabins. I collected these stories from people willing to tell them, and I typed them into this document late at night when the city outside falls into its approximation of silence. But the bark appeared on my windowsill 3 days ago, and last night I heard breathing, slow and deep and rhythmic, coming from the ventilation shaft in my bathroom, that same 10 seconds in and 10 seconds out pattern that Murray described from behind the boulder in Blue Valley Range. The mountains remember. The mountains choose. And apparently the mountains don't appreciate their stories being collected and shared. Or perhaps they do appreciate it, and this is their way of marking the storyteller as part of the story, of reminding me that documenting these accounts makes me complicit in them, that bearing witness changes the witness, and that some territories claim you not through physical presence, but through the act of attention and the dangerous curiosity that makes you want to understand what lives in the folds of. The oldest mountains where humans are temporary visitors, and something patient and ancient has always been home and will always remain after we've forgotten how to warn each other about bone lines and canvas-hatted men, and the breathing that comes from behind boulders where nothing should be breathing at all.